It's time for another episode of the DoDCast. Today, Ricky Keeler chats with TBS's Casey Stern about the upcoming Nationals Cubs divisional series.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it.
So my first question for you would, when this matchup became official, what was your initial thoughts? Because this looks to be arguably the best division series out of the two we know and the two that are to be determined in the next couple of days.
Yeah, I think it's the best division series in terms of matchup that we've had on paper in many years. I've been talking to people around the game about this over the last couple of weeks, and everybody seems to come to the same thing. And one of the things that I've been saying, Ricky, is that it reminds me of kind of like when a Steve Young and a Brett Favre would match up for some reason in like a divisional playoff, and you could easily see either of those teams winning the Super Bowl. I have the winner of this series representing the National League in the World Series, and I'm picking the Nationals to win the World Series. So I believe that this is the best matchup. I believe that these two teams are both capable of making deep runs, and I think it's one of the best matchups we had in a DS in a long, long time.
You said the Nats win this series. You think they're going to win the whole thing. What makes you believe the Nats are finally going to break that curse and win the World Series?
The way Steven Strasburg's been pitching. Strauss is a guy who has been, crapped on because either people haven't thought he's tough and he has been brittle at times, or he hasn't, been consistent, or he hasn't stayed healthy. I mean, there are a number of different things. Obviously, we don't have to go back through the shutdown and his career. But I think this is a guy who's on a mission, and I think in the second half of the year, he's clearly, for me, the best pitcher in the National League. He ended up winning Pitcher of the Month, I believe, in September, and his ERA was like under 1 during the course of the second half. I've never seen him consistently pitch this well. I obviously am friends with Dusty. I've spent time with the Nationals. I spent some time with them when they were down in Atlanta. And, in talking to the people around that club, I think everybody has the same approach. I mean, this is the best he's ever looked on a consistent basis. So I'm buying. I think that he's a guy on a mission. I believe he's a guy who's, turned a corner in terms of his confidence. And I think when you've got Max Scherzer, health be willing, knock on wood, and you've got Steven Strasburg, that's the best 1-2 punch you're going to find in this playoff if Strasburg is pitching the way that he has been.
We know Strasburg has already had his coming out party a few years ago when he made his debut, and then he got a chance to pitch in the playoffs a couple years ago. But the way he's pitching now, this appears to be, I would think, Casey, his national coming out party if he is as dominant as he was in the second half.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I remember being on the air after that Pirate game, and people wanted to try and downplay what he did. The Pirates weren't very good at the time, but he struck out, I think it was 13. It was on MLB Network, and that was the high. And then after that was the shutdown, which necessarily wasn't his fault. Really kind of became about, well, he must not want it bad enough. And I think that, nationally people kind of, steered away from him for that. Then there was inconsistency. He's always had the stuff. The stuff has never been a question. But I think there's a difference between throwing and pitching. And this is a guy who can always throw. Now Steven Strasburg knows how to pitch. And I wouldn't downplay the fact that, having leaders, having Mike Maddox around over the last couple of years, I think, the right guys have been in his ear. I also give him a ton of credit. I think, he's put a lot of work in. He's, found a way to find consistency. This is a guy who clearly needs to try and keep it simple because he's got so many different weapons that, sometimes you can get out of control and not just remember that you can get people out with your fastball. But, yeah, I would agree with that. I think this is his coming out party if he has a successful postseason. The other side of it, and the unfortunate side, is as much as we're talking how highly we think of Steven Strasburg, if he were to, again, have a bad postseason, begin next year, that even Strasburg be able to live up, ...
So with Max Scherzer's injury, I mean, he gets a cramp, then they get an MRI, and now it's up in the air if he'll pitch Game 1. Now, I would think, Casey, the best thing, if he's not going to throw Game 1, you throw in Game 2, and then since the Nats, I think, really need to win the series, it might be better off having him ready out of the bullpen in Game 5. If you were
up if they win. Now, Gio Gonzalez is a difference maker here because in the past, and even if Strasburg was pitching well, then you have two guys, but Gio's had his best season of his life, and he's been extremely good. I think if you win Game 1, I think, honestly, Ricky, you pitch Gio in Game 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you win Game 2 and Max isn't feeling well, you try and hold him. You get, again, all this, it's hard to answer because I'm not trying to give a cop-out, but I'm not with him in the room, and I don't know how banged up he is. I'm assuming that he's sore, and with that, if I can get away with it, Max Scherzer pitching in this series is most likely going to be a necessity to win it. Remember this, though. Max Scherzer's mirror image is on the other side. Jake Arrieta's had health issues. He hasn't been 100% down the stretch. And I personally don't believe that the Cubs can win this series without Arrieta winning at least one game in it, if not two. I think Arrieta's the most important Cub in this series against the Nationals.
It just seems there's a big contrast where if the Nats don't pitch Scherzer, at least they have Gio and Roark. I doubt the Cubs even want to think about going with John Lackey, who's given up 10 runs this year against the Nats, compared to Arrieta.
Yeah, the thing is I think Quintana's, honestly, to be quite frank with you, I think that's a guy who could be a difference maker. Let's not also forget, Joe Madden has been a regular on my radio show for the last, I think, 8 years at this point. He told me that Kyle Hendricks in September looked as good as he's ever looked, including last postseason. So if they think that Hendricks has found himself again, and let's not forget, look, Quintana has not gotten to pitch a lot of big games. He pitched for the White Sox. But in covering Caribbean baseball, I can tell people that's way more important than any regular season game you're going to see. And that dude went in the WBC representing his country and shoved it against the U.S. They couldn't touch him. And to me, I think even though to a lot of us who sit there from an American standpoint, what does that mean? That guy's in more pressure on that standpoint, honestly, than he's going to be in Game 3 or 4 in this series. And it's not close. And he would tell you the same thing. So I think this is a guy who's got big money pitching in him. He was fantastic down the stretch, and I think Quintana is a major, major factor. But I agree. Look, Arrieta, the way he pitched in the second half of the season, and clearly he's trying to get paid this offseason, he's the most important player on the Cubs. If he does not pitch well, extremely well, they have no chance in this series or any series they play.
Now, on Monday on MLB Network Radio, you said the Nats have the best lineup out of all the teams in the postseason. What do you like the most about this lineup?
The balance. I've never seen a left-right lineup like this. Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'd have to go back a long, long period of time. And, one thing that's happened in our game is that in the back end of the games of the postseason, they're now one in the bullpen. We saw it with the Giants 3 times, saw it with the Royals getting to 2 World Series that way, and clearly we saw it with the Indians. But this is the one lineup that really, of all the lineups in baseball, and I think Houston's got a great lineup, and Cleveland's very capable, certainly the Yankees, the Dodgers, there are others. But this lineup, left, right, I mean, first of all, their lefties can crush lefties. Daniel Murphy will hit anybody. But the fact that they can go left and then go right with a Rendon or a Zimmerman and left, the fact that Rendon's been down in the order hitting 6, I'm not even mentioning Trey Turner. And then off the bench, the same versatility. You got Lynn from the left side, Howie Kendrick from the right side. I don't remember in a long, long time seeing the kind of balance that Dusty has to work with in-game and late-in games in that lineup. And I think they're going to be a nightmare for opposing bullpens down the stretch because you can't bring in lefty, lefty, righty, righty unless you're trying to bang out a wasted guy on one pitcher, on one hitter. I don't remember a lineup, honestly, like this in a long period of time. But just case in point, go back to 2010, you had Jimmy Rollins is on our crew. You had Utley and Howard. So what do the Giants do? Well, you got lefties back-to-back. I'll look at Javier Lopez from the Pirates, and I'll go send the Phillies. You can't do that with this team, and I think they're fantastically set up for deep games and late-inning heroics and pinch hitting, and there are decisions in there, but I love the balance of this lineup.
The one player, Casey, I'm slightly concerned with would be Ryan Zimmerman, who's had a great season. Last 2 years against the Cubs, he's 8 for 56 with 17 strikeouts. Do you think those numbers are going to play a factor to him, and how critical is he to this series?
I don't think he's critical. I think he's important. I think at some point you'd like to see him make contact and hit a 2-run homer. I don't think he's critical necessarily. I think he's critical for the lineup because of the presence that he brings, but I don't think he's critical. I'd say critical for Trey Turner.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say critical for Bryce Harper. I wouldn't put critical on Ryan Zimmerman. I think they could win this series if he wasn't on this team. I mean, that's how good I think the Nationals are. So I won't put him at critical. I don't look. It depends. Everybody's different. If this is not a guy who I'm worried about his confidence. As you know, he's a very even-keeled guy. So if he was somebody where I thought he was going to get shaken by that, then I'd worry. But there are a couple of things I need to point out. Number one, in a wild card game a few years ago, Buck Showalter went with Joe Saunders, and everybody thought he was nuts because his ERA was like 6+ against Texas, and even worse than that in that stadium. And he shut him out for 6 innings.
Mm-hmm.
2 years ago, the Mets had lost all 7 games against the Cubs in the regular season, and none of their pitchers had done well. And then they wiped them off the face of the postseason, 1, 2, 3, 4, with the same pitchers. So I just don't think that stuff matters unless the confidence is going to be shaken from either the hitter or pitcher because they're afraid. Case in point, Jonathan Broxton many years ago against the Phillies in 2 separate postseasons against Matt Stairs and the Phils. I absolutely think the second time he was shaken before he came out to the mound. I don't see Ryan Zimmerman that way, so I'm not worried about it.
Both of these teams have good closers with Wade Davis and Sean Doolittle. But what team do you think has the edge in the bullpen?
I got to give the edge in the bullpen. I think both could be very good, and Doolittle's been fantastic. I worry about Sean a little bit only because, he's not a guy whose arm you can wear out. So when you get into this postseason grind, I worry about that a little bit. I like Madsen a lot. I think Kinsler was a fantastic pickup. I'm sure the Twins would like to have him tonight in this wild card game. I like the lefties and their capabilities. I like the depth, but I think you've got to go with the experience here. So outside of Madsen, most of those other guys have not gone nearly as deep as Wade Davis has done twice. Did it as a setup man where really he was a second closer the first time at 14. Then in 15 he was a dominant closer. C.J. Edwards and Montgomery were closing out the final innings of the World Series last year. Schroep pitched big innings for Joe last year in that situation in the postseason. And a lot of the same guys are down there. Justin Wilson, I'm curious to see how he kind of fits in. The Cubs have more experience. And then, the X factor is going to be like how they use a John Lackey, who looks like he could end up in that spot. Somebody in that starting staff is going to be able to give them some interesting damage control in the postseason. And, those things always come into play. Mike Clevenger was a big factor in a couple of different games for the Indians last year in that role. So, I like the depth and the experience a little bit in both cases towards Chicago.
How do you expect Joe Maddon to go about pitching to Harper in this series?
I think he will pitch to Bryce at the beginning of the series like he's Bryce, and I think he'll be careful. Now, as you know, because of the lineup we just talked about, you can only be so careful. This isn't the situation last year where, he walked Harper and treated him like Barry Bonds and he went into a funk because, last year you didn't have Ryan Zimmerman and Anthony Rendon having the 2 years that they're having this year from the right side. So I think he'll be careful-ish. However, Joe and his staff will absolutely be paying attention to the way Bryce looks. So if it looks like, hey, he's just out there for really his presence, but he's not, a shell of what he's supposed to be, and the lower half isn't there, and the hands aren't ready, and he's in spring training mode, and it takes some time, and he hasn't seen enough at-bats. If all of that plays out, you may see them go after him more later in the series, but I think especially in Game 1, you will see Bryce Harper pitch to like he is at the top of his game MVP version of Bryce Harper because they're not going to make a mistake and try and pitch around him and get caught.
Last question for you, Casey. You worked with Dusty Baker a couple of years ago at TBS. You've had conversation with him. How important do you think this series is for his legacy? And with his contract not being decided next year, does he have to win this series, in your opinion, to keep his job?
Let me start with the last part, and you can quote me on this. The fact that I'm even being asked that question, and I don't blame you because it's a question in D.C., is an embarrassment.
Mm-hmm.
The fact this man hasn't been offered a contract is an embarrassment. He came over, he's won 2 divisions. At some point, players have to play. Everybody blames Dusty for, Mark Pryor, Kerry Wood. You know how many times Joe Torre wore out his bullpen? How many World Series did he win? You know why? Because players performed. Last year, Joe Maddon very clearly made nearly a horrific mistake with Aroldis Chapman. His players bailed him out, and he won. You never puts everything on Dusty. Where else are you going to go? I mean, I just don't understand the fact, to be honest with you, that we're even discussing him not having a contract. So it certainly bothers me. He shouldn't have to. I will tell you this. If he wants to continue to manage, he will get an opportunity elsewhere if the Nationals don't want to get him, because I'm sure other teams will think, hey, look, would you rather start the season knowing you're going to win 90 and go to the postseason and then figure it out, or pick someone else? So I think he's in good hands either way. The other part of it is for the legacy. One thing I've talked with Dusty about over the last number of weeks a couple of times is I find it really fascinating in a kind of coming-of-age full circle for his career that it looks like he'll have to beat the Cubs and the Dodgers to get to the World Series. And, outside of the Braves, I mean, those are the two other franchises where he's, had the most history. We know about all his playing time with the Dodgers, his relationship still a little assorted with that franchise, and clearly his time in Chicago coming oh so close. So I do find it kind of poignant that we're getting to a point where Dusty probably has to go through a this-is-your-life type of postseason to get to the World Series.
Yeah, it just seems kind of odd that with all the distractions around the Nationals with the pitching injuries and the whole you haven't won a series yet, that they have to deal with the fact that the manager doesn't have a contract past next year.
Yeah, it's stupid. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I hear, teams say that, and this may be the way the Lerners and Mike are, I don't know. But, they didn't want Dusty in the first place. They wanted Bud Black. Mm-hmm. And, Dusty's done a hell of a job. I think, clearly it worked out. I think it worked out for all parties. Buddy's done a fantastic job this year with Colorado. But, where else are you going to go? Look, Dusty's not going to manage for the next 15 years. Clearly we're talking about a guy who is on the older side. But this team's trying to win a World Series. So, barring the fact that, he goes ahead and pulls some Grady Little that people think is costing the postseason, people need to start recognizing that players play. When an employer tells an employee to do something, even if it's the wrong decision, if the employee does it right, he will cover the you-know-what of the employer. It's no different than what we do for a living than what they do for a living. If the pitchers pitch well and the hitters hit, the manager looks like a genius. If they don't play well, they're scared, they choke, they grip the bat too tight, then the manager looks like an idiot. And I think in both cases, we need to kind of come back from the ledge a little bit and understand it's about the players, not the manager.
Casey, thank you for taking the time. Good luck with the pre- and post-game hosting of the playoffs here on TBS, and thanks for taking time again. We appreciate it.
Ricky, anytime, man. Be well. I'll talk to you down the road.
You got it.
We'd like to thank MLB on TBS studio host Casey Stern for taking a few minutes to speak with us today. Casey is back for pre- and post-game coverage with Pedro Martinez, Gary Sheffield, and Jimmy Rollins of every game of the National League postseason. Remember, TBS is the exclusive home of the National League throughout the 2017 MLB postseason, and the Nats and Cubs will be called by Ernie Johnson and Ron Darling, with Sam Ryan on the sidelines. Game 1, of course, 7:30 on Friday night, and Game 2 from Washington on Saturday at 5:30.